table in the Semitic culture, even if you're sitting down at table with your enemy. I said, even if you sit down at table with your enemy, all barriers are gone. I mean, sitting down with your enemy is the same as sitting down with your friend. When you sit at table, when you break bread with the other person, you're saying everything that's gone on between us, gone. Just like sand of the ocean, just gone.
It never happened.
It never happened, right. All those past images. You don't have to come to the table with your sidearm on. You don't have to come to the table with your...
How about your cell phone?
Turned off. Yeah.
Probably good to leave it, you
Yeah.
know?
The point is, when you sit down at the table, you're sitting down with friends, regardless, you know. Now, we do in our culture, frequently we say, if there's anything between you and your other, this is a story that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the tax collector praying before God, and the Pharisee says, "Oh, thank you, Lord, for not making me like the tax collector." And the tax collector saying, "Oh God, help me to do better." It's one of putting ourselves in a place where we are. It's not whether we're better than or in a better place. It's about being in a relationship.
Some versions of the Bible in that context says that the Pharisee was praying to himself.
That's probably a pretty good interpretation. It's not something, in many ways, we pray to ourselves because we say things God doesn't want us to say. We don't need help with some of the things that we think we need help with. Okay, I'm going around the bush. Are there questions about Holy Communion or things that you have done in the past or things that you want to do better or different?
I've been living a perfect life.
I'm a perfect person.
It's good.
You responded the appropriate way. A laugh is appropriate.
I know one thing that I want to be able to do is make the most of what time I have, because I realize how quick things can happen. And my wife, 11th of January, was out walking with a friend of hers, and she got stung by a dove right here. She was highly allergic. I got to the park. Her friend had called the ambulance. By the time they got to the park, they said they got these straps and collapsed. And by the time the ambulance got there, she was gone. And the doctor said, once you hit the park, it took about 11 seconds to a minute. And my wife said to me, when I come back, come and walk over to the buffet. And Pastor, after all that, he said, the only time we really have is the next step forward.
That's right. We have now. We don't. The only thing we have is the present. We plan, and I think we must plan, but we can't live in the future. We can't live in the past. We live in the present. And again, that's part of, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I no, regret is past, worry is future, yeah, regret.
That's right. The thing about sacrament, another aspect of sacrament, is it is in the present. Yes, it's based upon, or in some ways, it's tied to a historic event of Jesus having supper with his disciples. But it's also tied to the other suppers that Jesus had with other people, the mealtime. But the reality is, it's in the present. Christ becomes present to us in the bread and in the cup. The means of grace is all about presence. It's all about God meeting us in the present, in the present event. God may meet us in the future, but God can't meet us in the future until we're present. So.
But we have to be at a point to accept that grace.
That's true.
Sometimes you get mad at God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things for no really good reason happen, and you get mad at God. And I know my God's big enough to handle my anger.
He can deal with it.
He can deal with it. But until I pass that point,
Mm-hmm.
I can't commune
Right,
and accept His grace.
right.
So there are times in a person's life that you have to get yourself right.
Isn't that grief? Isn't that what the process of grief is about?
It can be grief.
Can be anger too.
Well, and anger is generally a part of grief that
I was
we.
just angry because I was going through
Through.
what I was going through,
Through.
and I had no reason to go through it. So why was I being put through that? Now,
But I think in some, I mean, you're absolutely right. But grief is something that we have to go through. Anger is something we must go through.
That's a step.
It's not a place to dwell.
no.
And it's moving out of that.
And it's something that I could not share with other people. I could share it with my husband. He and I were very close. But I could not share it with my congregation that I was angry, because I felt that being angry with God was almost like blasphemy. You know, something you just didn't do. You know?
No, I think you bring up an excellent point, is that God's able to deal with us wherever we are. I'm not saying that God only meets us in a good place. And I think that's what you're saying too, that God doesn't meet us just when we're happy and everything's going well. And God doesn't always just meet us in the valleys either. God can meet us where we are. That's why communion is important, because if it's on a scheduled basis, doesn't matter. One Sunday you're going to come, everything's going great. This is peace. Next Sunday, there's been a tragedy in the family. There's been, somebody's lost their job. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. You're in a different place when you come to that communion table. I think that there is, again, I would never command a person to say, well, you've got to take communion at that time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying God's going to meet you wherever you are. Even in the midst of your anger, God can be present in the midst of that.
You don't have to have the elements to commune with God.
That's exactly
And while the
right.
others are having the elements, you can communicate.
You don't have to have the elements to commune with God.
You know, I had a great grandfather in the 104. Was my mom's grandfather, very, very godly man, very educated. He had a way of communicating with people, keep the relation. People asked him, how did you get that age? He said, I had to go through a lot of pruning.
A lot of pruning. Yeah, the healthy branches, I mean, it's not just the dead branches that get pruned off the tree. So we go through some pain. For some reason, God created us, I think, to several psychiatrists, psychologists, theologians have, I guess, what I want to say, theorized, but postulated. There you go, thank you. That we learn a lot more in the midst of pain than we do in the midst of bliss. And so, I wish it were otherwise. And that could probably be a subject of our prayers. But the truth seems to be that we grow more when we're being pruned. And that seems to be a fact of life. My roses are always a lot more beautiful when I prune them than they are if I don't.
Well, pruning is a slow process. It's an ongoing process.
It is an ongoing process, you're right.
And, you know, our son passed 3 years ago, and it took me a long time to adjust, even though he kept telling us, I'm not going to live to see 40. But last night, I saw this guy in Reading, and maybe some of you saw the news, where he had gone shopping, and his wife was at home with his kids and his grandkids, and she called him up and said, you know, the fire is getting close. You come and get us. So he's on his way to get them, and he stops to help somebody who had gotten burned. But he never made it. They kept calling, he kept talking to them, and the last thing they said was, we love you, Daddy. We love you, Granddaddy. That's the saddest thing I ever heard in my life.
Yeah, it's on the news tonight too.
You know,
Yeah.
one of the things, I said to,
Marcus, could you talk louder?
one of the things, my great grandfather, I call Papa, he said to me that it's because we get so many thorns in our life, and God has to remove those thorns so we can be fruitful. And sometimes those thorns get a little deeper.
And sometimes the thorns bother some other people. It's true. Stories. Yes.
I think, you know, talking about growing, when we have to go through bad stuff, I think it especially grows our faith.
Yeah.
Every time he brings us through something that was so hard to accept and so hard to get over, each time that happens, we're renewed in our belief, in our assurance,
Okay.
in our assurance of his presence and his help, and especially his love. Anyway, it's just, we need him more at those times, and I think he gives us more, and
Well, and I think
That's kind of why we gave more.
we're probably open more too.
Oh, yeah, we're so needy. Yeah.
People don't always get through things though, which is where, as somebody who tries to live a life of love, there's a chance to
Right.
represent the Lord in some small way, sometimes just a tiny way.
We become a vessel of grace. And see, I think we can be a means of grace to others in many ways. I shared last week, taking communion, where, I'm going to encourage Tony to try this sometime, is inviting people to take communion with somebody else. Not just your spouse. I mean, that's okay too. But we stand and we take communion and look at the person across the cup from us. We're in essence sharing.
We've done that before in going around the sanctuary. It's been like on a Good Friday, it's been on a special occasion. And you're right, it is very humbling, you connect with that person.
I have the image of a husband and wife who, in my congregation at the Coolidge, I think their tradition had been, both of them were raised in the Catholic church. And so communion was very important to them. And when I began to do communion every Sunday as part of our worship experience, they participated, and they always came together, and they always took communion looking at each other. And they would both take a piece of the bread and they'd dip it in, and they would look at each other as they took. And so one of the last things that we did when Bob was in hospice, and he was in the last hours, and we went and took communion to them, and he and his wife took communion. And then it was as if his journey was this way and her journey was this way. And it became the permission for him to continue, continue his path. It was also permission for her to let go and to move on her path. So there was a means of grace there for each of them in that particular moment. And I would encourage you, it doesn't have to be just this sacrament, doesn't have to be something that we just do. My point of us having this discussion is for us to see it in a more meaningful way. To know that it is a means of grace for us to become more of who God is created to be. But not only that, and not only that, and not only that, because it is a mystery. The reason I think you could take this sacrament every day and it would not get old is because you're different every day. And God meets us in a different way. And the mystery of this sacrament is so great that it never gets old. It never gets passé. It never gets less meaningful. It's one of those unusual things that when the more you do it, it's like my dog eating dinner. The more he gets, the more he wants. I think that's why means of grace, why sacraments are so important for our faith journey.
I was trying to think, when I was a child, we were not allowed to take communion as a child.
That's a holdover from the older Roman Catholic thought process.
But
It influenced.
We let our kids here take communion.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
See, my comment in that is, when somebody says, well, they don't understand it, then I say, well, you tell me what you understand.
Yeah.
We don't understand it.
No.
It's a mystery.
Right.
And in many ways, sometimes the kids understand it more than we do. I've told you my story in Coolidge of the kids on Christmas Eve, haven't I? We always had children helping us serve communion. There would be an adult and a child helping serve communion each Sunday. So on Christmas Eve, when we had our first service, family service, I invited all the kids to come forward, and then I'm wondering which one of these kids am I going to, they all wanted to serve communion because it was such a big deal to them. And so I decided, well, I want I had all the kids come forward, and all the children and youth took communion first. And then I invited them to go back and bring, each one of them could bring as many people forward. So they basically escorted and brought people forward to take communion, and they took communion with them. I said, you can take communion as many times as you want. And I saw, they went back and they got grandparents and brought them forward and had communion with them. They went forward and brought the single person who was in church and came forward and had communion with them. They knew how meaningful it was, and the parents and the grandparents and the other adults in the congregation were impacted by that. I saw adults coming up the aisle with tears just streaming down their face because the youth was coming forward to have communion with them. So when somebody tells me that youth and children don't understand it, that's, in some ways, they grasp grace better than we grasp it. They know that they can't earn everything. They know they're not able to do everything. And they understand grace at a level that we can't get to easily. So, in answer to your question, I think the church has moved to understand. It's one of the reasons that we talked about last week of baptizing infants.
Yeah.
When you baptize an infant hasn't earned the grace they're receiving. What can an infant do? Cry.
Play about it.
Do they change their own diapers? They don't change their own diapers. Somebody has to change the diapers. Somebody has to feed them. They receive. They know how to receive God's grace. I mean, that becomes the symbol for that idea of receiving God's grace in baptism. Same thing applies. We're talking about a means of grace. Communion is a means of grace. We need to learn to receive that grace that God has offered us. We don't, if you think you earned it, then it's not grace. It's not grace. And the church has moved, I think. The pendulum swings back and forth, and we're in a sense where we understand grace, or we acknowledge grace probably more so than maybe 50 years ago we did. And I think it's a good thing. We all, we just have to learn to give ourselves grace. We have to learn to give others grace. And the person that hung up on us, or the person that sent us the wrong forms, or all of those kinds of things that
Money
happen.
in the bank.
Yeah, the person that stole your credit card or whatever, or
Or your generator.
my generator.
Yeah, generator. Great for them.
Hang on to that one.
So the idea of means of grace is to get us in touch. Those are, the means of grace is tying the material elements that are part of our life and seeing God working in those. They become symbols, they become ways, like if it's a special place, if it's a special person, it's a special time, birthdays. Birthdays can be a means of grace, especially if you're 101. Birthdays, anniversaries, those are means of grace. One of the weaknesses of our society, we talked about this when I was going through seminary. That lady that wrote that book right there, marvelous professor, Mary Elizabeth Moore. It talked about the rituals that we have in our life and how important the rituals can be as a means of grace for us. Other cultures have rituals of maturity for children. One of the reasons that we have, I think, many of the problems that we have in our society is that we don't have enough coming of age rituals that help our children know that they are becoming something other than children and youth. The Hispanics have the quinceañeras. The Jewish have their rites of
Bar and bat mitzvah.
and
No rites of passage.
we don't have rites. The rites of passage in our society are driving license.
Driver's license.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Or the age to drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of
Buy
times when
cigarettes.
we do things like that, I can remember my mother, not with me, but with her grandchildren, did special things when the young ladies, and they were so embarrassed they couldn't handle it.
Oh, yeah.
Because they had never heard of this, it had never come into their world before.
But those rites of passages are also means of grace.
Yes, yes.
I mean, they can be. We can see them as means of grace. So that's something that we can do in our culture, is think of ways that we can develop rites of passage or rituals for our kids, grandkids, great-grandkids that will help them see those times as a means of grace, of God working within them for grace. So, it's tied. Communion there's nothing like communion, but it's not the only way that God meets us and God connects to us.
See how, if you say that sentence, you kind of put the N in instead of the but. See how much. Really?
Okay.
Yeah.
And it is not the only way that God meets us. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you. It is core. It is central. And much of what we understand of our faith is tied up into that mystery of communion. So I think the ritual is important. The rituals, as I shared last week, the fact that there is a great Thanksgiving. If you look in the book of worship, you will find that there are a great Thanksgiving for the different seasons of the church. So that ritual can change. It doesn't have to be the same every time. You can even write your own that reflects the setting from which you are in. There's when a tragedy occurs in a communion or in a community, and you're having, say, a community worship, it would be very appropriate for the pastors who are leading that worship service to write a great Thanksgiving that addresses that tragedy within the society. Or maybe it's something, it's been a great blessing in the community. If you're having a worship service, write words to the great Thanksgiving and to the confession that have meaning to what's happening right then and there. And but don't depend upon your solo pastor in a 600-member church to be able to do that all the time. And so there needs to be a team of people to help with that. Any of you writers or poets? That's one of the ways that you can express yourself, is through writing liturgy. Cynthia Langston Kirk, who's one of the pastors that I was ordained with, who's recently retired, that's her gift. Is writing liturgy and poetry that tie into worship. So somebody want to send us off with a prayer, a blessing, a gift?
Volunteer, go for it. Go for it.
I'll lead us some.
Okay, Marcus, go ahead.
Precious Lord, we're so grateful that we can be here. We're grateful, Lord, that you allowed us to be born and to live in a free society where we can worship you. Help us to realize, Lord, how blessed we are in so many ways. We're blessed physically, we're blessed politically. We live in a time of great comfort and vast knowledge. Lord, help us to remember, though, that the best knowledge we can have is the knowledge of your love for us, and that you will guide us and direct us in all we do, Father, if we just ask you. Precious Lord, bless each of us here now and every family represented as we go on our way, and bring us back safely the next time to study your word and to learn more about you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Next week, we will begin our
Listen, girls.
we will address the way forward. And if you get a chance, check out some of the videos, because I think that'll be the we will be watching in here where Gil Rindle provides an overview of the work of the commission. We will be watching that in here.
So we don't need to watch that.
You don't need to.
Because we're watching it here.
We will be watching that.
I'm glad you came tonight, just especially to hear you talk about rights. You said that, there's a lot of work with kids, and I thought, this is what's missing. There's no accomplishment, a driver's license is like,
Yeah.
This was very,
Right.
there's no part.
Good to call me out.
Yeah,